Back in 1979, a massive revolution swept through Iran. It was built on huge promises: social justice, freedom, and independence for the country. But now, decades later, for so many Iranians, that promise feels, well, unfulfilled. So, what happened? What went wrong? And what does it all tell us about Iran today? Now, get this. This quote isn't from some dissident living in exile. This is from a political science professor right there in Tehran. It's a pretty stunning statement, and it just cuts right to the heart of the tension in Iran today. This huge, gaping disconnect between the dream of the revolution and the reality on the ground. So, that's the big question, right? How did a revolution that so many people supported, one that was all about freedom and justice, end up in a place where most people, hypothetically, would vote against it? To even start to unpack that, we've got to go back in time, to the world that existed before the revolution, to an Iran ruled by a king, the Shah. Okay, so before 1979, Iran was run by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. And look, on the surface, it seemed like a time of incredible change. Modernization was happening everywhere. But underneath all that glitter, deep, deep fractures were starting to crack society wide open. It was like a gilded cage. This right here really gets to the heart of the problem. The Shah called his big modernization plan the White Revolution. The promise was progress, economic growth, all that good stuff. But the reality for millions of people was just the opposite. Their lives were turned upside down. It's a classic case of what you might call developmental shock. When change happens so fast, it just rips society apart at the seams. So what was pouring gasoline on this fire? Well, one word: oil. To put a number on it, between 1966 and 1974, that's less than a decade, Iran's oil revenue shot up by a staggering 3,700%. The country was just flooded with cash. But see, a tidal wave of cash like that, it brings huge problems. The economy just completely overheated. Inflation was out of control. We're talking rents in Tehran jumping 200% in a single year. Anyone who spoke out was crushed by the Shah's secret police, Savak. And on top of all that, there was this growing anger about all the foreign influence, especially from the US. People really felt like they weren't in control of their own country anymore. So all this frustration, all this discontent, it was basically the perfect storm for a revolution. And it created this really strange situation where all these different groups who had almost nothing in common came together. They were united by just one single thing. And when I say the opposition was broad, I mean it was really broad. You had secular thinkers who were worried Iran was losing its culture to the West. You had socialists and Marxists. You had students demanding democracy. You had the traditional merchants in the bazaar whose businesses were being threatened. And of course, you had the very powerful and very organized clergy. It was what some historians call a union of negatives. They all just hated the Shah. So who was the person who could possibly bring all these different groups together? That would be Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Speaking from exile, he was a master at crafting a message that appealed to absolutely everyone. For the religious, he was a revered spiritual leader. For the secular folks and the students, he promised political freedom for men and women, a government run by the people. He basically took every single grievance in the country and pointed it like a weapon straight at the monarchy. Okay, so you've got this unlikely alliance, you've got a unifying figure, the stage is set. And the monarchy, which seemed so unshakable for so long, started to fall apart with just astonishing speed. And wow, did things happen fast. It really kicked off with a protest in January 1978. When the Shah's forces killed some students, it was like lighting a fuse. You see, in Shia tradition, there are mourning ceremonies 40 days after a death. So those ceremonies turned into new protests, which led to more deaths, which led to more mourning ceremonies 40 days later. One historian called it a great revolutionary lung. It's this tragic but powerful cycle. By Black Friday in September, the violence just made people angrier. The Shah had clearly lost control. He fled the country in January 79, and just a couple of weeks later, Khomeini flew back to a massive hero's welcome. That was it. The monarchy was done. Okay, so the revolution works. The Shah is out, the people won, but what about those big promises they made at the beginning? Social justice, freedom, and independence. Let's take a look at the report card. Yeah, when you actually look at the report card, it's complicated. Take social justice. It's a mixed bag. They did pour a lot of money into rural areas and education, which was great. But freedom and democracy? That one's a clear fail. The old authoritarian king was just replaced by a new authoritarian theocracy. And what about independence? Well, they definitely achieved that. They kicked out US influence. but the price was staggering: international isolation, sanctions, and a brutal war with Iraq. I mean, just look at literacy rates to see one of the successes. Before the revolution, it was a dismal 15%. Today, it's nearly universal. You just can't argue with that. It's a huge, tangible achievement of the Islamic Republic. But, and this is a huge but, all that social progress came with a massive political price tag. That promise of democracy, it just never happened. Instead, they built this unique system, this kind of hybrid authoritarianism. It's a system where, sure, you can vote for a president and a parliament, but the real power, it's held by people you can't vote for, like the Guardian Council that decides who can even run, and at the very top, the supreme leader. Real opposition is simply not allowed. So where does all this leave Iran today? Well, it might help to think of the revolution not as the end of the story, but as just one very dramatic chapter in a much, much longer one. And this quote, I think, really frames the whole struggle in a new light. The desire for freedom in Iran didn't start in 1979, and it definitely didn't end there. The opponent might have changed, from a king to a cleric, but for many, many Iranians, the fundamental fight for freedom continues. And that, brings us right back to the very beginning. Those promises of 1979 are still such a powerful idea in Iran, mainly because, for so many, they're still unfulfilled. So the question that hangs over the country today is the same one that's been there for a long time. What will the next chapter of this search look like?